The mountain air bit at my cheeks as I stood at the edge of my newly purchased property, gazing at what most people would consider a complete wreck. But not me. I saw the weathered wooden cabin nestled among towering pines, as the dream I'd chased for years, a 90-year-old piece of American history that was now mine to restore. "You're absolutely insane, Simon," my friend Mike said, kicking at the rotting steps leading up to the front porch. "This thing is one strong wind away from becoming a pile of kindling." I ran my hand along the rough-hewn logs, feeling the history beneath my fingertips. "That's where you're wrong. These old-growth logs are stronger than half the new construction going up these days. They just need some love." What I didn't mention to Mike was that I'd sunk every penny of my inheritance from my grandfather into purchasing this property in the picturesque mountains of northern Colorado. The cabin sat on 3 acres of land in a development called Pine Ridge Estates, a name that felt too polished for the rugged beauty surrounding us. "Did you even check if there's an HOA?" Mike asked, squinting at me in the bright mountain sunshine. I waved him off. "It's basically inactive." The realtor mentioned something about it, but said nobody's enforced anything in years. This area is all about mountain freedom, not suburban rules. If I'd known then how wrong I was, I might have walked away right there. But hindsight is always crystal clear. Unlike the murky waters of homeowners association politics I was about to wade into. I spent that first night in a tent beside my cabin, falling asleep to the sound of wind through the pines and dreaming of what this place would become. My grandfather had taught me everything I knew about woodworking and restoration. This cabin would be my tribute to him. The next morning I was up with the sun, making a detailed assessment of what needed to be done. The foundation was surprisingly solid. These old-timers knew how to build things to last. The logs themselves were in decent shape, except for some rot near the ground on the north side. The roof would need to be completely replaced, and all the windows were either missing or broken. I was taking measurements for replacement windows when I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel road leading to my property. A shiny white SUV with Pine Ridge Estates emblazoned on the door pulled up, and a woman with a perfect blonde bob and oversized sunglasses stepped out. "Excuse me," she called, her voice carrying the kind of forced cheerfulness that immediately put me on edge. "You must be the new owner." I set down my tape measure and walked over, extending my hand. "Simon Owens. Just got the keys yesterday." She ignored my outstretched hand and instead thrust a thick binder toward me. "Patricia Winters, president of the Pine Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. This is our welcome packet and complete bylaws. I noticed you're doing some work on the structure." She said the last word like she was referring to something unpleasant she'd found on the bottom of her shoe. "Just assessing what needs to be done. It's going to be quite a restoration project." Patricia's smile tightened. "Mr. Owens, I'm afraid there's been some misunderstanding. This structure was grandfathered in when the HOA was established in 1997, but any significant modifications trigger our standard architectural review process." She pointed to the binder. "Section 14, paragraph 3. I took the binder but didn't open it. The realtor said the HOA was inactive." Patricia's laugh was like ice cracking. "Inactive? We had our quarterly meeting just last week. We've been very active in maintaining property values in Pine Ridge Estates. That's why homes here sell for 20% above comparable properties in neighboring developments." I gestured to my cabin. "This isn't exactly a standard home. It's a historic structure." "Historic?" Patricia's eyebrows rose so high they disappeared behind her bangs. "It's an eyesore, Mr. Owens. Frankly, that should be torn down and replaced with something that meets our community standards." The words hit me like a physical blow. torn down. My dream, my inheritance, my connection to my grandfather all dismissed as an eyesore in an instant. "That's not happening," I said, my voice firm. "This cabin was built in 1933. It has historical significance." Patricia's smile was now completely gone. "It has no official historical designation, Mr. Owens, and our bylaws clearly state that all structures must conform to the Pine Ridge aesthetic guidelines." She tapped the binder in my hands. "I'll expect your architectural review application by the end of the week, if you intend to do any work beyond basic maintenance." With that, she pivoted on her heel and returned to her SUV, leaving me standing there with a heavy binder and an even heavier feeling in my stomach. That night, I pored over the HOA bylaws by lantern light in my tent. The inactive HOA had rules governing everything from exterior paint colors, earth tones only, to landscaping, native plants preferred, no vegetable gardens visible from the road, to the type of mailbox permitted, rustic bronze or black, no novelty designs. There was an entire section dedicated to architectural standards, requiring all homes to adhere to a mountain lodge aesthetic with specific materials and design elements. Nowhere did it mention historic preservation or restoration of original structures. According to the bylaws, any structure predating the HOA establishment in 1997 was permitted to remain as is, but would need to conform to current standards if substantial modifications were made. I closed the binder and stared at the cabin silhouetted against the star-filled sky. I hadn't come here to build some cookie-cutter mountain lodge. I'd come to restore this piece of Colorado history. The next morning, I drove into town to speak with a local attorney. Hank Mullen had been recommended by the realtor as someone who knew the area. His office was above the hardware store on Main Street, and the walls were covered with fishing trophies and old maps of the county. "HOA troubles already?" Hank asked after I explained my situation. That was quick. Usually, Patricia gives folks at least a week before she starts in on them. "You know her." Everyone knows Patricia Winters. Been ruling Pine Ridge with an iron fist for about 15 years now. Hank leaned back in his creaking chair. "Used to be a reasonable association until she took over. Now they've got more rules than the federal government." "Can she really force me to tear down my cabin? It predates the HOA by decades." Hank scratched his chin. "The grandfathering clause is pretty standard in HOA bylaws, but they're often written to trigger compliance if you make substantial changes. The question is, what constitutes substantial? Restoration work that maintains the original character might be different from renovation that changes it. I want to keep it exactly as it was, just make it structurally sound and livable. Then document everything. Take pictures of every step, show that you're preserving, not changing. And I'd recommend getting a historical assessment. If you can prove it has historical value, you might have additional protection." I left Hank's office with a plan and stopped by the County Historical Society on my way back to the cabin. Martha Davies, the elderly curator, was thrilled when I mentioned the location of my property. "The old Jensen place," she exclaimed. "Oh my, we have photographs of that cabin from the 1930s in our archives. Lars Jensen was one of the early loggers in this area. Built that cabin himself in '33, if I recall correctly." My heart raced. "Do you think the cabin might qualify for historical designation?" Martha pursed her lips. "Possibly. It would need to be assessed, of course. But if it's still largely intact, it represents an important period in our local history." She disappeared into a back room and returned with a dusty photo album. "Here, these might help you." The black and white photographs showed my cabin when it was new, a sturdy log structure with a covered porch and stone chimney, surrounded by freshly cut stumps. A bearded man in work clothes stood proudly beside it, axe in hand. "Could I get copies of these?" I asked. "Of course, dear. And I'll put you in touch with the State Historical Preservation Office. They can tell you more about the designation process." Armed with historical photographs and contacts at the Preservation Office, I returned to my cabin feeling more confident. I was setting up a camping table outside to spread out my new resources when another vehicle approached, not Patricia's SUV, but a pickup truck with Pine Ridge Estates maintenance on the door. A thin man with a clipboard stepped out. "Mr. Owens, Dale Henderson, HOA Compliance Officer. I'm here for the initial assessment." "Assessment? I haven't submitted any application." Dale consulted his clipboard. "Mrs. Winters requested a baseline documentation of the property's current condition, standard procedure for properties requiring substantial work." Before I could object, Dale was circling my cabin, taking photographs and making notes. "Just documenting the current state," he called over his shoulder. "I'm planning a historical restoration," I said, following him. "Not a renovation or rebuild." Dale paused, lowering his camera. "Between us, Mr. Owens, you might want to reconsider. Mrs. Winters has had her eye on this property for years. She's been waiting for the previous owner to sell so the association could purchase it and clear it for a community pavilion. This was new information. The HOA wanted to buy this land." Dale glanced around nervously. "I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but they were planning to make an offer when it came on the market. Mrs. Winters was pretty upset when it sold before they could act." Suddenly, Patricia's hostility made more sense. She wasn't just enforcing HOA rules, she was angry that I'd purchased a property she'd wanted for the association. "Thanks for the heads up," I said. Dale nodded and returned to his documentation. When he finished, he handed me a form. "You'll need to submit your plans within 30 days or the association can begin enforcement actions." After he left, I called Hank again and told him what I'd learned. "That explains a lot," Hank said, "but it also makes your situation trickier. Patricia isn't just being a stickler for the rules, she has a personal interest in seeing you fail." "What do you recommend?" "Proceed with the historical designation process. In the meantime, document everything meticulously. And I'd suggest attending the next HOA meeting, get a feel for who else is on the board and whether they're all in Patricia's pocket." The next 2 weeks were a whirlwind of activity. I began careful restoration work on the cabin, focusing on structural integrity while preserving as much of the original material as possible. I photographed everything before, during, and after, creating a detailed record of my preservation efforts. I also submitted an application for historical designation through the state office, including Martha's photographs and additional research on Lars Jensen and early logging communities in the area. When the HOA meeting rolled around, I dressed in my most respectable clothes and arrived early. The meeting was held in the clubhouse of a nearby golf course, and about 20 residents were in attendance, along with Patricia and 4 other board members seated at a table at the front. "Welcome to our monthly meeting," Patricia began, her voice carrying the same forced cheerfulness I'd encountered before. "We have several items on the agenda tonight, including a discussion of the summer landscaping schedule and a proposal for updated mailbox standards." I sat quietly through discussions of sprinkler systems and decorative post caps, taking note of the dynamics. Patricia clearly dominated the conversation, with the other board members rarely contradicting her. Most of the residents seemed disengaged, checking phones or whispering to each other. Finally, under new business, Patricia brought up my property. As many of you know, the old abandoned cabin on Wildflower Lane has recently been purchased. The new owner has been advised of our architectural standards, and we're awaiting his formal application for the necessary demolition and new construction. She looked directly at me. "Mr. Owens, would you like to introduce yourself to the community?" I stood, feeling all eyes on me. "Thank you. I'm Simon Owens, and I want to clarify that I have no plans for demolition. The cabin on my property was built in 1933 by Lars Jensen, one of the original settlers in this area. It's a historical structure, and I'm in the process of restoring it to its original condition while making it safe and habitable." A murmur ran through the room. An elderly man in the back raised his hand. "Jensen's place. I remember that cabin from when I was a boy. My father used to buy lumber from old Lars." Patricia's smile tightened. "Regardless of its age, Mr. Owens, the structure doesn't meet our community standards. The bylaws are very clear about the aesthetic requirements for Pine Ridge Estates." "Actually," I countered, "the bylaws specify that pre-existing structures are grandfathered in. I'm not changing the exterior appearance, I'm restoring it to its original condition. Restoration still requires architectural review and approval," Patricia insisted, "especially when the structure is in such dilapidated condition." Another resident spoke up, a middle-aged woman with silver-streaked hair. "I think it's wonderful that someone wants to preserve a piece of local history. Not everything needs to look like it came from a catalog." Patricia's face flushed. "Rebecca, we have standards for a reason. Property values affect everyone in this community." "I'd like to see the cabin when it's restored," Rebecca continued, ignoring Patricia's glare. "My grandmother used to tell stories about the early logging camps." Patricia quickly moved to regain control of the meeting. "We'll continue this discussion when Mr. Owens submits his formal application. Moving on to our next item." As the meeting adjourned, several residents approached me, expressing interest in my restoration project. Rebecca Lewis introduced herself and offered to help with historical research. "I've lived here all my life," she said, "and I've got boxes of old photographs and documents from my family that might be useful." I was gathering my things when Patricia cornered me by the door. "Mr. Owens, let me be perfectly clear. Your application will be denied. That eyesore needs to come down and something appropriate needs to go up in its place." "On what grounds would you deny a historically accurate restoration?" I asked. Patricia leaned in, lowering her voice. "I've been maintaining standards in Pine Ridge for 15 years. I've dealt with plenty of difficult residents who thought they could ignore the rules. Trust me when I say that cabin will not remain standing." The threat was unmistakable, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. The next day, I returned to the cabin to find a notice taped to my tent. It was an official warning from the HOA, citing me for unauthorized camping and storage of construction materials without proper screening. I had 72 hours to remove the tent and properly store all materials, or I would face daily fines. I called Hank immediately. "They're coming at you from every angle," he said after I read him the notice. "The camping violation is shaky. You're allowed to temporarily reside on your property during construction in most counties here, but the material storage might stick. Those rules are designed to prevent properties from looking messy during construction. So I need to build a fence around my materials, or move them inside the cabin if it's structurally sound enough. Just make sure whatever you do complies with their rules to the letter." I spent the next day building a simple privacy screen around my construction materials, exactly as specified in the bylaws, 6 feet tall, made of approved materials, in an earth tone color. I also moved my tent inside the cabin, which was risky given the state of the roof, but technically complied with their rules against visible temporary structures. Patricia was not pleased when she arrived for an inspection and found I had addressed the violations. The screening is acceptable, but residing inside an unsafe structure is a code violation, she said, making notes on her clipboard. I've had a structural engineer assess the cabin, I lied, prepared for this argument. The main supports are sound. Patricia's eyes narrowed. We'll need documentation of that assessment for our records. I'll have it sent to you, I said, knowing I'd need to actually hire an engineer now. As Patricia was leaving, she paused. You know, Mr. Owens, there's an easier solution. The association would be willing to purchase your property at a fair market value. You could avoid all this difficulty. So that was her game. I'm not interested in selling, I said firmly. Patricia shrugged. The offer remains open, but I should warn you, restoration costs can spiral quickly. And our fines for non-compliance can add up just as fast. After she left, I called Rebecca Lewis, who had given me her number at the HOA meeting. I need to know more about how this HOA operates, I told her. Patricia just offered to buy my property. Rebecca wasn't surprised. She's done this before. There was a couple a few years ago who wanted to build a contemporary home all glass and angles. Patricia made their lives miserable with violations and fines until they gave up and sold to a developer who was friendly with the board. Is that even legal? It's a gray area. HOAs have broad powers, and it's hard to prove harassment when they can claim they're just enforcing the rules. Rebecca paused, but Patricia may have overstepped recently. There's been talk that HOA funds were used to purchase a property for a board member's relative at below market value. This was interesting. Do you know who might have documentation of that? Frank Turner was treasurer until last year when he resigned suddenly. He might know something. I tracked down Frank Turner, who now lived in a neighboring development. When I explained my situation, he invited me over. Frank was a retired accountant who had served on the Pine Ridge HOA board for 6 years. I left when I couldn't stomach the ethical violations anymore, he told me, serving coffee in his immaculate living room. Patricia runs that place like her personal fiefdom. I heard there might have been some questionable property transactions, I prompted. Frank nodded grimly. About a year ago, the association purchased a foreclosed property on Aspen Way, supposedly for a future park. 3 months later, it was sold to Patricia's sister-in-law for 20% less than the HOA paid for it. The park plans mysteriously disappeared. You have records of this. Frank hesitated. I kept copies of the financial transactions. I was considering reporting it, but he sighed. Patricia has a lot of influence in this community. I was worried about repercussions. Would you be willing to share those records with my attorney? After some convincing, Frank agreed to provide the documentation to Hank. Armed with this new information, I felt I had some leverage, but I wanted to focus on my primary goal, restoring my cabin. The next few weeks were a dance of restoration work and HOA evasion. I hired a structural engineer who confirmed what I already knew: the basic structure was sound, though it needed significant work. I submitted my restoration plans to both the HOA's Architectural Review Committee and the State Historical Preservation Office. Patricia found new violations weekly. My construction noise violated quiet hours, even though I worked only during permitted times. My truck was parked improperly. Despite being fully on my property, my temporary mailbox didn't meet standards, though it was identical to the one used by another resident down the road. Each violation came with a fine, which I refused to pay, citing my pending architectural review and historical designation applications. The fines accumulated, and threatening letters from the HOA's attorney followed. Meanwhile, I made progress on the cabin. I replaced rotted logs with period-appropriate materials, carefully preserving the patina and character of the original structure. I repaired the stone foundation and began work on rebuilding the chimney using historical photographs as a guide. Rebecca and other interested residents occasionally stopped by to check on my progress, bringing coffee and encouragement. It became clear that not everyone in Pine Ridge shared Patricia's vision of homogenized mountain lodges. 6 weeks into my restoration, I received 2 important letters on the same day. The first was from the State Historical Preservation Office, informing me that my cabin had been deemed eligible for inclusion in the State Register of Historic Properties based on its age, condition, and connection to early logging industry in the region. The second was from the HOA Architectural Review Committee, denying my restoration plan and ordering me to cease all work immediately. The denial cited inconsistency with community aesthetic standards and inadequate modernization of the structure. I called Hank immediately. They denied my application even though I got historical eligibility. Can they do that? This is where it gets interesting, Hank said. Once a property has historical designation, HOAs typically have limited authority to restrict preservation efforts. But you don't have the official designation yet, just eligibility. So what do? Keep working. Document the historical significance. And I think it's time we used what we learned from Frank Turner. Hank drafted a letter to the HOA board, all members. Not just Patricia, detailing the questionable property transaction. Frank had documented and suggesting that using HOA authority to pressure me to sell my property could be seen as part of a pattern of ethical violations. The letter stopped short of threatening legal action but made it clear we were prepared to escalate if necessary. The response came not from Patricia but from another board member, Alan Rogers, requesting a private meeting. We met at a coffee shop in town, away from Pine Ridge Estates. This situation has gotten out of hand, Alan said after we'd exchanged pleasantries. Most of the board had no idea about the pressure being put on you. We were told your restoration was a safety hazard and violated multiple covenants. It's a historical restoration, I explained. The State Preservation Office has already deemed it eligible for the state register. Alan nodded. I did some research after receiving your attorney's letter. Your property is one of the oldest structures in the county. It should be preserved, not demolished. Try telling that to Patricia. Alan sighed. Patricia has been overzealous in her role. The information about the Aspen Way property transaction is concerning. The board was told that sale was at market value. So where do we go from here? There's a board meeting tomorrow night, executive session, not open to residents. I'll bring this up and push for reconsideration of your application. In the meantime, I'd suggest continuing your work. If it truly is a historical restoration, I believe we can find a compromise. The day after the board meeting, I received a visit from Patricia. Her SUV screeched to a halt in my driveway, and she stormed toward me, waving papers. What exactly do you think you're doing? She demanded, her face flushed with anger. Spreading lies about me to the board. I set down the hand planer I'd been using on a replacement porch beam. I simply shared factual information about a concerning transaction. You have no idea what you're talking about, Patricia hissed. That was a completely legitimate transaction approved by the board. According to the former treasurer, the board wasn't given accurate information about the sale price. Patricia's eyes narrowed. Frank Turner is a disgruntled ex-board member who was asked to resign because of his incompetence. Is that what you told the board? Because he says he resigned due to ethical concerns. Patricia stepped closer, her voice dropping to a threatening whisper. Listen carefully, Mr. Owens. I've built this community into what it is today. I will not let some newcomer with a rotting shack destroy everything I've worked for. This rotting shack is a piece of history, I countered. And from what I hear, not everyone in Pine Ridge shares your vision of cookie-cutter luxury lodges. The board has authorized me to offer you one final opportunity, Patricia said, ignoring my comment. The HOA will purchase your property for the price you paid, plus 10%. That's more than generous considering the violations and fines you've accumulated. I looked at my cabin, at the careful restoration work I'd completed on the porch, at the new roof beams being prepared, at the period-correct windows I'd sourced from a salvage yard. I thought of my grandfather and the skills he'd taught me, skills I was now using to bring this piece of history back to life. Not interested, I said simply. Patricia's professional veneer cracked completely. That thing will be torn down, she spat. One way or another. I've already contacted the county about safety violations. If the HOA can't force you to comply, the county will condemn it. As she stormed back to her SUV, I noticed Rebecca Lewis parked on the road, witnessing the entire confrontation. She approached as Patricia drove away. I recorded that, Rebecca said, holding up her phone. The thread at the end, that could be useful, I was surprised. You recorded our conversation, Rebecca nodded. I've been documenting Patricia's behavior for months. Several residents have concerns about how she's running the HOA, but everyone's been too intimidated to speak up. This was an unexpected development. Would you be willing to share that recording with my attorney? Absolutely. And I'm not the only one with stories to tell. Over the next few days, more residents reached out, sharing their experiences with Patricia's heavy-handed enforcement and personal vendettas against those who challenged her authority. One elderly couple had been fined repeatedly for their bird feeders, which Patricia claimed attracted nuisance wildlife. Another resident had been denied permission for a disability ramp because it didn't meet aesthetic standards. Meanwhile, I received notice from the county building inspector that a complaint had been filed against my property, alleging unsafe conditions and work without proper permits. Patricia was making good on her threat. I met with the inspector, Ron Jeffries, and showed him my restoration plans, the structural engineer's report, and the historical designation eligibility letter. Looks like you're doing things right, Ron said after reviewing the documents and inspecting my work. You'll need permits for the electrical and plumbing when you get to that stage, but the structural restoration is solid. I don't see any safety issues here. So the complaint was unfounded. Ron gave me a knowing look. Let's just say this isn't the first time I've been called out to Pine Ridge on questionable complaints. Mrs. Winters seems to have the county on speed dial. With the county inspection cleared, I continued my work with renewed determination. The roof was my next major project, replacing rotted supports while preserving the original pitch and appearance. I was up on the roof, carefully removing damaged shingles, when I heard a commotion below. Patricia had returned, this time with Dale and another man I didn't recognize. They were taking photographs and placing markers on my property line. "Excuse me," I called down. "What's going on?" Patricia looked up, shading her eyes against the sun. "Property line survey. The HOA has concerns that your restoration work may be encroaching on common area land." I carefully made my way down the ladder. My cabin is at least 30 feet from the property line on all sides. There's no encroachment. "We'll let the surveyor determine that," Patricia said with a smirk. I watched as they placed stakes and took measurements. knowing this was just another harassment tactic. When they finished, the surveyor confirmed what I already knew: my cabin and all construction materials were well within my property boundaries. Patricia was undeterred. "We'll need to review these findings at the next board meeting. In the meantime, I notice your construction debris screen doesn't extend to the east side of the property." I had removed part of the screen that morning to allow delivery of roofing materials, intending to replace it afterward. "I'll have it back up within the hour," I said. "Too late. That's a violation of Section 8.2 of the bylaws. You'll receive a notice and fine." This petty enforcement was becoming tedious. "Do what you need to do, Patricia. I'm going to continue my work." As Patricia and her team left, I called Hank to update him on the latest developments. "She's getting desperate," he observed. "These trivial violations and unfounded complaints show she's running out of legitimate options." "I'm just trying to restore a cabin," I said, frustration evident in my voice. "Why is this such a crusade for her?" "Control," Hank said simply. "People like Patricia derive their sense of worth from controlling others. Your cabin and your refusal to comply represents a challenge to her authority." The next HOA board meeting was scheduled for the following week. Based on Alan's advice, I prepared a comprehensive presentation about my restoration project, including the historical significance, the preservation techniques I was using, and how the restored cabin would actually enhance the character of Pine Ridge Estates. The night before the meeting, Rebecca called with alarming news. "Patricia's stacked the agenda," she said. "Your property is listed under enforcement actions, and there's a motion to proceed with legal action for accumulated violations. She's trying to push it through before you can present your case." "Can she do that?" "Technically, yes. As president, she controls the agenda, but I've been talking to other residents. We're planning to show up in force to support you." The meeting was held in the same golf club room, but the atmosphere was entirely different. Instead of the usual 20 or so attendees, the room was packed with at least 50 residents. Patricia looked visibly shocked as people continued to stream in. "We'll need to move to a larger room," Alan said, rising from the board table. "I wasn't aware we'd have such attendance tonight." Patricia attempted to regain control. "We have a full agenda tonight, so we need to proceed efficiently." First item: enforcement actions for ongoing violations at 1457 Wildflower Lane. Rebecca stood up from the audience. "Point of order. According to the bylaws, residents have the right to speak on issues affecting their properties before enforcement actions are voted on." Patricia's face tightened. "Mr. Owens will have his opportunity to speak briefly before the vote." "Actually," Alan interjected, "I believe we should move the presentation on the historical restoration to the beginning of the meeting, since it relates directly to the enforcement question." A murmur of agreement ran through the crowd, and Patricia, outnumbered, reluctantly agreed. I presented my case, sharing the historical photographs, the Preservation Office's eligibility determination, and before and after pictures of my restoration work. I explained how I was using traditional techniques to maintain the cabin's historical integrity while ensuring it met modern safety standards. "This cabin represents an important part of our local history," I concluded. "It tells the story of the early settlers who built this community. I believe preserving it enhances Pine Ridge Estates by connecting us to our roots, rather than detracting from property values." The room erupted in applause when I finished. Resident after resident stood to speak in support of my project. Rebecca shared stories her grandmother had told her about the early logging days. The elderly man who remembered Lars Jensen spoke about the cabin's significance to local history. Even a real estate agent from the community stood to say that unique historical properties often increased, rather than decreased, surrounding property values. Patricia sat stony-faced throughout, occasionally whispering to Dale beside her. When the public comments concluded, she attempted to redirect the conversation. While the historical aspects are interesting, we must consider the aesthetic impact on our community. The architectural guidelines were established to maintain a cohesive appearance that benefits everyone. Alan spoke up. I think we need to recognize that historical preservation represents a special case not fully addressed in our current guidelines. Perhaps we should form a committee to develop standards specifically for historical structures within Pine Ridge. Another board member nodded. I agree. And in the meantime, I move that we suspend enforcement actions against Mr. Owens' property pending the development of these new guidelines and the final determination of historical designation. Patricia objected vehemently, but she was outvoted by the other board members. The motion passed, and I was granted a reprieve from the violations and fines that had been accumulating. As the meeting adjourned, Patricia stormed out without speaking to anyone. Residents crowded around me, offering congratulations and support. Several asked when they could visit to see the restoration progress, and others offered to help with research or even the physical work. The following week brought an unexpected development. A letter arrived from the county district attorney's office, requesting an interview regarding possible misappropriation of HOA funds. It seemed Frank Turner had finally decided to formally report the questionable property transaction. 2 days later, the local newspaper ran a story about an investigation into financial irregularities at several area HOAs, with Pine Ridge prominently mentioned. Patricia was quoted as denying any wrongdoing and characterizing the investigation as based on misunderstandings and incomplete information. The day after the news story broke, Patricia's white SUV once again appeared in my driveway. She looked different. The perfect blonde bob was slightly disheveled, and her typically immaculate appearance showed signs of strain. "Mr. Owens," she said, her voice lacking its usual commanding tone, "I believe we may have gotten off on the wrong foot." I set down the piece of trim I was sanding. "That's one way to put it. The board has been discussing your restoration project further, and we've decided that with the historical significance, there may be room for accommodation within our guidelines." This sudden reversal was suspicious. "What kind of accommodation?" Patricia forced a smile. "A variance that would allow the restoration to proceed as planned, provided certain minimal standards are met: proper landscaping, appropriate exterior lighting, that sort of thing." "Reasonable requirements I'd have met anyway," I noted. Patricia nodded stiffly. "In exchange, we would request that you reconsider your perspective on certain HOA matters that have been raised recently." So that was it. With the financial investigation looming, Patricia was trying to neutralize potential witnesses or complainants. "You mean the financial irregularities being investigated?" Patricia's smile vanished. "Those allegations are completely unfounded, but community harmony is important, and continuing disagreements benefit no one." "I appreciate the offer of a variance," I said carefully, "but I have no control over the district attorney's investigation. That's a separate matter." Patricia's facade cracked. "Do you have any idea what you've started?" "I've dedicated 15 years to this community, maintaining standards that protect everyone's investments. And now my reputation is being questioned because of some malcontents and a decrepit old cabin." "I didn't start any investigation," I said truthfully. "I just wanted to restore a historic structure." Patricia laughed bitterly. "You think this is just about your cabin? This is about control, Once exceptions start, where does it end? Pink houses, car repairs in driveways, clotheslines and garbage cans visible from the street. Standards matter. I looked at her, seeing for the first time not just a power-hungry HOA president, but someone whose entire identity and sense of worth were wrapped up in controlling her environment. Patricia, the cabin will be beautiful when it's restored. It won't hurt property values or community standards. It will honor the history of this place. She shook her head. You don't understand. Once the rules start bending, they eventually break. With that, she returned to her SUV and drove away. It was the last direct conversation I would have with her. The following month brought significant developments. The State Historical Preservation Office officially added my cabin to the State Register of Historic Properties, providing additional protection against HOA interference. The Pine Ridge Board, with Alan now serving as acting president, approved new guidelines specifically addressing historical structures, essentially creating a carve-out for properties like mine. Patricia had taken a leave of absence from the board following the expansion of the district attorney's investigation. The local newspaper reported that the investigation now encompassed multiple questionable property transactions and possible misuse of HOA funds for personal expenses. With the HOA battles behind me, I was able to focus fully on my restoration work. The cabin progressed rapidly, the roof was completed, new period-appropriate windows were installed, and the interior was carefully renovated to maintain historical character while incorporating modern conveniences discreetly. Throughout the summer and fall, residents regularly stopped by to check on my progress. Rebecca organized an informal historical society focused on early settlement in the area, using my cabin's restoration as a launching point for broader discussions about preserving local history. By the first snowfall, the exterior restoration was complete. The cabin stood much as it had in the 1930s photographs, sturdy logs carefully preserved or replaced with matching materials, a rebuilt stone chimney, and a covered porch where Lars Jensen had once stood proudly with his axe. In December, just before Christmas, news broke that Patricia Winters had been indicted on charges of embezzlement and fraud. The district attorney's investigation had uncovered not just the questionable property transaction Frank had reported, but a pattern of financial mismanagement spanning several years. The newly reorganized Pine Ridge HOA board, now led by Alan with Rebecca serving as secretary, invited me to their holiday gathering at the clubhouse. The atmosphere was noticeably different, friendly, collaborative, focused on community building rather than rigid enforcement. You know, you started quite a revolution here, Alan said as we stood by the fireplace, watching residents mingle. People were afraid to challenge Patricia for years. Your cabin became a symbol of standing up to unreasonable authority. I just wanted to restore a piece of history, I said. I never intended to upend the entire HOA. Sometimes the right thing creates waves, Rebecca added, joining our conversation. But in this case, the waves were needed. The HOA exists to maintain the community, not to bully residents or serve as someone's personal power trip. As spring arrived, I completed the interior restoration and finally moved from my tent into the fully restored cabin. The local historical society, now formally established with Rebecca as president, organized an open house to celebrate both the cabin's restoration and its historical designation. Nearly 100 people attended, including residents from Pine Ridge and neighboring communities, history enthusiasts, and even Ron Jeffries, the county building inspector who had refused to find violations in my work. Lars Jensen's grandson, now in his 80s, traveled from Utah for the event after learning about the restoration through the Historical Society's research. He brought additional family photographs and his grandfather's original tools, which I promised to display prominently in the cabin. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows through the pines, I stood on the porch, the same porch where Lars Jensen had stood 90 years earlier, and looked out at the community that had eventually rallied around this piece of history. The cabin stood as it was meant to be, not an eyesore to be torn down, but a testament to craftsmanship and history, a link between past and present. And in saving it, I had inadvertently helped a community rediscover what truly mattered beyond property values and uniform aesthetics. Patricia's trial was scheduled for the following month, and the new HOA board was working on revised bylaws that balanced necessary standards with respect for individual expression and historical preservation. The rigid control she had maintained for 15 years had given way to a more collaborative approach. As the open house wound down and visitors departed, I sat alone on the porch steps, running my hand along the smooth wood my grandfather had taught me to work. In the distance, I could see new construction in Pine Ridge Estate's modern homes with all the luxury amenities Patricia had prioritized. But here, in this small clearing, history had prevailed. The cabin would continue to stand, just as it had through 9 decades of Colorado winters, a reminder that sometimes the oldest things have the most to teach us about what endures.